This tutorial is the postage stamp tutorial. We're going to use some generative graphics and draw a little postage stamp, sort of custom graphic, by generating different lines and different shapes. Okay, so and then this the purpose, I guess, is so that we have some kind of generative graphics so that we can play that with our mouse theremin. So to begin with, we have our basic setup here, basic template of setup. We have our void setup, which is, remember, run once at the very beginning. And then we have our void draw, which is a loop that runs at a frame rate. So 60 times a second or 24 times a second, depending on how fast our computer is. Okay, and I just want to draw your attention to one thing. I'm going to do something a little bit different in the setup, and I'm going to put the background in the setup. Now all that means is that it's going to draw the background once, which will be black, and then everything in draw will just draw on top of that background. Now, normally we put background in draw because that every time we draw a new something, then it just sort of erases everything and then draws the next thing, so we can have animations or things move about. If we didn't have a background in draw and we're trying to move things about, do some sort of animation, you'd get a trail or a tail, like a worm sort of tail. Okay, so what we want to do, and I'm going to show you, the first thing I'm going to show you is to draw lines. We're going to draw a number of lines randomly in sort of random locations within the area of our postage stamp. All right, so why don't we start with the end there, and we will draw a line. Now, if you recall, the line method in processing is looking for arguments of x1, y1, x2, and y2. And that just means that this is the first point, x1, y1, and this is the second point, x2, y2, and it's going to draw a line between the 2 points. All right. Now, I'm going to try to generate these points, this information, and I'm going to just use the random function. So if I go ahead and just create this variable, a temporary variable, right within draw, and I'm going to call it x1 because that's what I used down there, and I'm going to say equals random. Now, I'm using float because the random function generates a floating point number, and it's just easier. I can convert it to integer, but the line will accept float, so I'll just keep it there. Now, random, you may or might not know, generates a random number. So if you just give it one argument, it's going to generate a random number between 0 and 5. If I give it 2 arguments, it's going to generate a random number between 5 and 10. Okay. So what I want to do actually is I want to have a location for this postage stamp. And then I want to have sort of a size to the postage stamp, and I want to be able to draw these lines within this sort of postage stamp area. So what we need to do is create a couple global variables. We need an X location, and that'll be the upper left corner of our postage stamp. And we'll just initialize that with 0 to begin with. And same with Y, 0. So we need a point that's going to be the upper left corner of our postage stamp. And then we need a size of our postage stamp. And we'll just have that be a 100. Okay, so if we want to generate a point, an X point, somewhere within our postage stamp, it's going to be at some point between X, which is our starting point, and X plus size. Okay, and then the same goes for all the other points. So we can just copy and paste. Y1 will be somewhere between Y and Y plus size. Presuming our postage stamp is square, which is what we want. We want a square postage stamp. And x2, y2 will just be exactly the same. It's just another point somewhere within our postage stamp. Okay. So if we run this, it should run. Let's give it a go. See what happens. All right. Okay. Well, one of the reasons it isn't doing anything is because we didn't give it any parameters about fill and stroke and all that. So it's probably trying to draw a black line on a black background. So if we go ahead and say no fill, because I am going to use some shapes later on and I don't want to fill them, I just need lines to trace. And we'll have a stroke color of white, 255. And we will have a stroke weight. And we'll just make it 2. And let's see what happens. Okay. Oh dear. So now it's just drawing a bunch of lines on top of each other. And remember, this is what happens when you have the black background not in draw. If I was to put background in, then it would just draw it over and then erase it and then draw it over. So you get this sort of animation. So we don't want either of those, really. What you want is just this to draw once and then just to stop. So I'm going to put a little gate in using a Boolean. And I'll just call it draw gate. And we're going to set it to true initially, and we'll probably change that later. And we'll say we're only going to draw these things if the draw gate is true. And remember, Booleans just go in without the is equal to sign. It just means if true. If draw gate is true, then go ahead and do that. Okay, and then what we can do is we can reset the gate within our drawing. So it's only going to draw it once, and then it'll stop it, right? So if we say draw gate equals false. Okay, so that's like a gate. Basically, the gate is open, and it opens up, it switches the gate to closed, and it draws it, and then the next time it comes around the loop, it's false, so it's not going to draw it. So that should just draw the one line. And there you go. One line without the animation or the lines piling up on top of each other. Very good. Okay, now what if we want to draw several lines? If we want to draw several lines, this is only going to draw one line and it's going to stop. All right. So why don't we move that down to the bottom here. Okay, so it's going to stop, and then we'll create some kind of process here that's going to draw us more than one line. All right, and this is sort of a lead into a for loop. You could use a for loop right here, and we'll learn that maybe a little bit later. But as a sort of lead in, we'll just use an if statement. We'll say if, and before we do that, let's create a variable, and we'll just call it the number of lines. Okay, and we'll say let's draw 9 lines. Okay. So if we'll say to create kind of a loop, if num lines is greater than 0, then we're going to do all this business. Okay. And I'm actually just going to comment this out because it won't draw. It'll only draw the one line. And we'll put it back in later just so you understand how that gate works. Okay. So if the number of lines is equal to 0, draw a line. All right. And then we're going to take away 1 from number of lines. So if we say num is equal to itself minus 1. Okay. So if we can just sort of walk through this, basically number of lines is an integer. It's represented by this word number of lines, a variable. But in fact, in actuality, it's the number 9. So in the beginning, when we start our sketch, this word, this variable, number of lines, is actually the number 9, the integer 9. So the first time through draw, the very first frame, it's going to look and say, is 9 greater than 0? Well, it is, and so it's going to draw a line. And for this instance, for this frame, it's going to generate random numbers in each of these cases and draw the line accordingly. After it runs that, then it's going to subtract from itself 9 minus 1. So in fact, number of lines now will be equal to 8. So the second frame will come around, and then it'll be, is 8 greater than 0? Well, yeah, it is. So draw another line, except this time it's a different set of random numbers and a different line. So it's going to generate that. And then it's going to subtract 1 from itself again, 7, 6, 5, 4, etc. Okay. Now, shortcut for this is, and I'll just leave this in but comment it out, is actually num lines minus minus. Okay, that just means minus 1 every time. All right, so if we run that, and there you see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines it generates. Okay. All right, that's great. Now remember, this is, you see it sort of pop in, and just as a little bonus, you see they sort of draw at the frame rate. So it's 1 line per frame. But you can have a different clock here too, and I'll just show you really quickly how to do that. So instead of running this bit of code once per frame, you can run it once every few frames. Okay, and the one way to do that is use what we call a modulo. So there's a thing called frame count. Okay, and that's going to give you the actual frame count. All right, so starting from the beginning, it's just going to keep steady count every frame. It's going to give you one more. All right, and so we're going to use if frame count modulo, and this will be a number how many times per frame. So if we say once every 5 frames, and the way modulo works is it gives you the remainder. So basically, if frame count is 1, modulo 5 will equal 4. And if frame count is 2, modulo 5 will equal 3, etc., 2, 1, down to 0, and then it'll start over again. Okay? So basically, this just sort of loops from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay? And we're going to say if it equals 0. So only when the frame count modulo 5 equals 0. So basically once every 5 frames. Then go ahead and run this thing. And we'll put the number of lines in there as well. So we'll keep the loop all the way there. So now the drawing should be just a little slower. There you go. And of course you can make it anything you want. If you want it once a second, about, 24 frames a second, or if it's 60 frames a second, we'll do once every 24 frames. And if you wanted to make this a very accurate clock, you could set your frame rate to 24 if you want. And that will set it to 24. So it'll be 1 every second. Okay. Well, that's just sort of a fancy trick. It's not that relevant to what we're doing. So we'll just get rid of that. Okay. All right. That's great. So now we have it drawing a number of lines, and that's great. It's drawing 9 lines now, and that works, and that's lovely. So the next thing we want to try to do is we want to try to have it draw only when we click the mouse. So we're just going to generate this when we click our mouse. Okay? And so this is where this trigger comes in. So let's go and set the draw gate to false. Okay? And then we'll only set it to true when we click our mouse. So there's a method in processing called mouse pressed. Okay? And remember, whenever you call a function or a method, you need to use void. And I won't go into it now, but that's just what it could return. And void just means it's not returning anything. It's not giving you back any values. Okay, and so the way void mouse pressed works is that every time you press the mouse, and that's just the downwards press, it's going to run everything within mouse pressed, all right, once. So I like to think of it as a scheduler. It's scheduling this code based on a trigger of the mouse pressed. So basically, if you never press the mouse, it's never going to be run. But every time you press the mouse, it'll run all the code in mouse pressed once. So what do we want to do? Well, if we press the mouse, then we want to open up this draw gate. So we can say if the mouse is pressed, or when the mouse is pressed, we're going to say draw equals true. And that'll open up the gate here. And then let's do our drawing. All right. So that's great. So let's see what happens if we do this. So nothing happens when I press our mouse, it draws. That's great. Okay. Good. All right, and it stopped drawing because of our if loop here, because our number of lines here. So why it's not doing that sort of animated sparkly thing is because it's gotten down to 0 and it's not drawing any more lines. Okay, so a couple of things we want to do. with that, and we'll get back to that later. But a couple of things we want to do is we want to now change the location of our little postage stamp when we draw. All right. So not only do we want to open up the gate so that it will draw, but we also want to set its location. And remember, we set the location here with this x and y, which currently are at 0, at least initially. So what we can do is we can move the x and y to where our mouse is. So we can say x equals mouse x. Remember, mouse x is a reserved variable that tells you what the mouse x is at all times, and then mouse y. Okay, so if we do that, when we press, it'll draw where we press. Okay, but it only draws 1 for now because we haven't fixed it to draw more than 1. All right, and in order to do that, we'll need to do a mouse. Well, I won't copy it. We'll do a mouse released. So there's another method called mouse released. Okay, and this, just like mouse pressed, runs all of the code within it when the mouse is released. All right, so what do we need to do when the mouse is released? Well, we want to reset the gate. Okay. So that it stops drawing, because we only want to draw those lines once. And also we want to reset the counter too. Okay, so, and what did we say it was up there? 9. Okay, well, in this case here, well, let's run it and let's see how that happens. So if we draw that, draw that, draw that, draw that, draw that, draw that. There you go. Everywhere we click, it's going to generate our graphic. Now, of course, depending on how many numbers, it's going to take at least 9 frames. So that, hold the button, for that many frames. Because if we release it before the 9 frames draw, we'll draw less than 9 lines, which might be kind of interesting anyways. You can draw a certain number of lines depending on how long you hold the mouse button. Okay. Now, the only one other thing here that's we haven't done is that change the variable here. If we want a different number of lines, we'll have to change a variable down here and up there as well. So why don't we just do this instead? We'll have a variable here that we can just change once for everything, and we'll call it int, and we'll call it initial lines. Okay, and that will make equal to 9. Okay, and then this number of lines, let's just initialize it here as a variable, and in setup we'll make it equal to initial number of lines equals initial. Okay, and then we can take that variable and make the number of lines here when we release the mouse back to its initial state, initial number of lines. Okay, so this way we could just change one variable and have it draw that many variables. Okay, without having to remembering to change it in lots of different places in our code. Okay. Alrighty, now let's go ahead and lines are nice, but what about having other shapes as well that are part of our generative drawing? All right, so let's go ahead and save that. So how about some arcs? Why don't we do that? Okay, once again, we can start basically, let's mark this area off here. We can say this is going to be lines. Put a little marker there, and that goes to there. Okay, and then the same thing, we're going to draw some arcs here. All right. So it's going to be very similar to our lines, except we're going to have to use a different object. So let's start at the end again, and let's have an arc, lowercase. Okay, and this is asking for x, and that's the center of our circle. That is going to be the circle of the arc, and a y. Those are the center points. Okay, it's looking for a width and a height, so we'll just call this size because it's going to be a perfect circle to fit in our postage stamp. And then it's looking for a start point in radians and an end point in radians. And so you can look at the examples in arc. That's probably the best way to sort of understand how the arcs work. And to understand the sort of unit circle, which is 0 to 2 pi. Here, it's drawing from, it's that first arc, 0 to half pi. So 0 is 3 o'clock, half pi is 6 o'clock. And then this next one is drawing from half pi to pi, so 6 to 9. This is pi to pi plus quarter pi, or pi and a quarter pi. That's drawing here, the little over 1. And this is pi plus quarter pi to 2 pi there, which is 0 to 2 pi. Okay, that's the unit circle. All right. Now, right. So basically we need R1, R2, and we need size and size. All right. And so what we need to do is generate these randomly. But first, let's determine where our location. In order for our arc to be within our square, remember, the lines were generated based on x and y here, x and y being the upper left corner. But the arc is looking for a x and y that's the center of the postage stamp. So we have to make some adjustments here. So, and let's not use x, y, because those are variables up there. Let's use ax and ay for arc x. Well, that's fine. That'll do. Okay. And so we'll say float ax equals, it's x, right? And again, just to illustrate, if our postage stamp is here, if our xy is this point here, we're looking for this point here in the center to make the center of our circle, which is in fact x plus half the size and y plus half the size, right? All right. So, well, let's just do that. It's x plus size divided by 2. Now, I think processing has order of operations, but I'm always liking to use parentheses just to be certain, and it makes the code a little bit clearer. And we'll say ay equals y plus size divided by 2. Okay, so that's our ax and our ay. That'll make the center of our circle that we're drawing the arc from in the center of our postage stamp. And the size of our, so let me just double check that that's not radius. So it says start, stop, C is the width, right? So it's the actual width and height of the entire circle, the diameter, not the radius, right? Okay, so that's fine, size and size, because that is the size of our circle, same size as our postage stamp. Now we just have to randomly generate here R1 and R2. But in fact, what we do, we do want to generate randomly the size as well, because we don't always want all of our arcs. We don't need all of our arcs to be this unit circle that's over here. So that means every arc will be, you know, here or here, but it'll be outside of this unit circle, right? We don't want that. We do, in fact, want to randomize that. So let's call this, let's call this ASC, A size, and it'll be the same, ASC, okay? And so the float ASC can be anywhere between y, well, since it's all the same, we'll just use x anyways. It could be anywhere between x And sorry, it can be anywhere from well, the smallest being 0, but we don't want 0 because that's just a point. So let's just have a minimum. We can have a minimum, say a width of say 4 pixels, something like that. So a random circle from a little tiny circle that's 4 pixels wide and high to all the way to size. Okay, we can do that. So now that's going to fill in either a little tiny circle 4 or anywhere up to size, up to the width and the size of the postage stamp. Okay, and then the other thing we want to randomize are R1 and R2. Okay. So what we can try to do really is we can constrain, we can limit it, but right now we'll just see what happens if we randomize them, both of them, anywhere between 0, random, 0, and then they have these processing has these built-in variables TWO pi. So that variable, reserve variable, is actually equal to 2 pi. Okay, and let's just see what happens if we generate 2 random locations, arc locations from 0 to 2 pi. It could just draw a big circle. It could draw nothing. Let's see what happens. Okay, and so that's going to draw that arc. And if I'm correct, I think it's just going to draw this sort of dancing arc. Yeah, that's right. See, it's drawing these dancing arcs, which is really interesting anyways. All right. So I think it's just a little bit of math here just to make sure that we're always drawing an angle in the positive direction. So I'm going to actually rename these variables as R1A and R2A. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly generate these two numbers, and then I'm going to figure out what the max is and what the minimum value is. So we're always going from minimum, the lower value, to the higher value. So I'm going to call R1 is going to be equal to the min of the two. So R1A and R2A. So it's going to take the smaller of the two. And then R2 is going to be the maximum of the two. R1A and R2A. All right, so that should work there. Now, as we saw when we tried to draw, we're having that sort of multiple lines being drawn on top of each other because we don't have this sort of gate going on. All right, and so we're going to need this this whole syntax here, this number of lines. Okay, and so we'll just copy that whole bit, and then we'll have, don't forget, we're going to have to end that scope. All right, and then outside that scope, we're going to do this number of lines minus minus, right? But of course, these are arcs. So if we want to have a different number of arcs and lines, we'll just call it number of arcs. Okay, and then up here we'll have to create. We'll create both of these. Oops. All right, so we now have an initial number of arcs. So we can draw 3 lines and maybe like 7 arcs, something like that. And let's see what happens. So draw 7 arcs, and our lines are based on that. And you notice that we have some nice harmony there. Okay. Now, again, in order to do these where we press our mouse, we're going to have to do the same thing here. So when our mouse pressed, but this should be based on this. Sorry, right. Equals x plus size, y plus size. And, oh, is this not in the draw gate? It's not in the draw gate. Okay, so this is the end draw gate. So that's a good thing to mark. All right, and then we'll just move that. So in fact, everything is now, the arcs and everything is in our draw gate. Oops. Okay. Okay, now that should be good to go. Yep, and we have our arcs and our lines. Oops. It stopped drawing our arcs, and why is that? Because we don't have this resetting it for our arcs as well. So we need number of arcs reset to our initial number of arcs. And that should work. Now another thing we can do, if you don't like the size of your arcs, you can constrain them as well. So we can say but maybe we'll save that for another tutorial. Okay, so we have our arcs drawing and we have our lines drawn. And finally, let's go ahead and draw some curves. All right. All right, and basically we can just copy this entire thing. And of course, we'll again have to make a bunch of variables and such, change things. And we'll just call these curves. And copy that. Curves as well. And why don't we call these curves? And we'll just copy that and paste that in. Okay. And again, starting from the end, let's just grab the curve syntax here from the help file. And we'll pop that in. So we're going to draw a curve from x1, y1, x2, y2, x3, y3, x4, y4. And we can just basically borrow this same syntax here, because we're just drawing some random points within our postage stamp, which will be done nicely with the same thing we use to generate the points for our lines. Except we just need more of them. So x1, y1, x2, y2. And we need x3, y3, and x4, y4. Okay. And just so we don't confuse ourselves with the lines, we're going to say cx, so that we're not repeating variable names. Okay, and again, we're going to have to copy this bit so we can have a different number of curves. And let's make maybe 4 of those. And again. Okay, and then remember, we're going to update this bit in here as well. All right, and that should do it. Hopefully this works. Okay, it's hard to tell because it's so busy, so why don't we make the number of lines 0 and number of arcs 0, and let's see what happens with our curves. All right, kind of draw some curves there. They're not super curves, but we get the basic point. Okay. And well, we'll just leave that there. That's probably good enough for us. Okay. So now we have generating curves, generating arcs, and generating lines. And you can choose the amount of each. Let's just do like maybe 2 of each. And let's increase the size just so it looks a little bit more dramatic. We can see what's going on. And let's see what happens if we draw that. And so that's an interesting graphic there that you can trace with your mouse theremin. And maybe make some interesting sounds.